Welcome to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. My name is Louise Mamouni and I'm here with my colleague Steph Croft from the Community of Practice Advisory Board. As host of this webinar and on behalf of the Community of Policy Professionals, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. We are on Gadigal land, but you might be joining us from Bundjalung land to the north, from Barkindji land to the west, or Yuin land to the south, but wherever you are joining us from, welcome. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and note that National Reconciliation Week starts next week. Now we have a very special guest with us on this live stream today. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian is joining us to talk about policy, including questions that were submitted from our members, including police, planning, industry and environment, transport, Premier and Cabinet, communities and justice, education, customer service and Office of Sport. In the interest of time, we've combined similar questions together on topics that had lots of interest. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get into it. Premier, welcome to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals. Is there anything you'd like to say to start with?
First of all, thank you for forming this community and thank you for the contribution you make to public policy, because at the end of the day, if we are here to improve the quality of life of our citizens, keep them safe, especially during the pandemic, but also talk about recovery and the future of the state, policy is integral to that. So I'm just deeply grateful for everybody who plays a part in that process, and also for all of you who work within the New South Wales Public Service. So I'm proud of each one of our nearly 400,000 employees. Actually, it's a bit over 400,000 employees, but obviously policy is the heart and thrust of everything we do. So thank you for your contribution.
Well, thank you, Premier.
There's so much good policy reform happening across the sector at the moment. What are the things that you look for or assess policy by when it comes to you for consideration?
There's a couple of things I look for when it comes to policy consideration. Firstly, what is going to touch the vast majority of our public? What is going to make a huge difference? Because governments can make a million policy decisions, but if they're very much just around the edges and not going to improve the quality of life of our citizens, it then makes them perhaps a lesser priority. But what is really important is that whatever policy we put forward is going to benefit our citizens. Also that it's practical, because sometimes things look really good on paper, but you can't really achieve them in a practical sense. And I think it's really important to think through not just the policy, but can a government actually implement this policy, and what would it take, and what is the roadmap? So I think there has to be a very close synergy between policy and implementation, and sometimes in government we might separate the two and say this is the policy team and this is the implementation team. But I actually think, and it depends on what various parts of the policy community here do, but it's really integral to have the implementation strategy as part of the policy, because the policy and the implementation have to be the one thing. Otherwise, you can't achieve either of them.
Yep, certainly very important, and probably some things that we will be working on more in the future, I think. So our members have asked, when they're working on a policy or a policy area, about how social or economic issues come to the forefront to be a focus for the government to address through policy. Can you share with us your expectations or perspective on how things get to the top of the pile?
No, certainly, and I think respectfully what gets to the top of the pile are what the government believes are the priorities, because there's no doubt that a good minister, a good leader will have a very clear vision for where they want to take their portfolio, where they want to, or in my case, the direction in which I'd like to take the government. So that the 12 Premier's priorities should give people an indication as to what the priorities are of the government. But I think it's also really important to have a proactive policy program, not just a reactive one, because it's really easy just to react all the time, but then it's managing through crisis. And what I always say to my colleagues is it's really important for us to have a proactive policy platform. What is our 20-year vision for the visitor economy, or what is our vision for improving service to the citizen through the Service New South Wales app, or what is our vision for the environment or a specific part of the environment? So I think it's really important to be proactive and to provide good, robust advice, because even if the advice you put forward might be different to what the government's announced or different to what the government's thinking, we still need to know. And I've often changed my mind based on good policy advice, because we all have, thought bubbles about what will work and what we think is really important. And then when you get advice that tests that, it actually makes you make a better decision, because you can actually get the expert advice, know that it's come based on fact and a good place and good intent, and then you might actually change your course or change your decision based on that advice. And that's happened to me a number of times. I actually like getting tested. I like my ministers to get tested. And certainly secretaries are tested every day. They manage enormous numbers of people and issues. So I think it's really important to have that level of robustness and a level of proactiveness as well. Because hopefully, if we're doing our job as a government, and if the secretaries are doing their job as leaders, which they are, you will have a good idea of what the government regards as a priority and how your specific policy responsibility fits into that framework.
So that's a good segue to our next question, which is, what do you think the key, the emerging policy issues are that we should be looking at across government?
Yeah, unfortunately, the emerging policy issues, many of them tend to be fundamentally similar to previous issues. I mean, all of us want to reduce intergenerational disadvantage. And unfortunately, we see that recurring. So there's a whole swag of policy areas where that's why I've elevated to priorities, because they're the type of areas where we need to do things differently. Traditional methods haven't worked. So what can we do to disrupt things in a positive way to actually get real change? So an example of that might be the way in which we've dealt with juvenile justice now, where we actually have reduced the number of young people in detention and looked at it as a social issue rather than a legal issue or a justice issue. And it's really important for us to try and change the way we do things. That's just one example. So very important for us to disrupt, to get rid of that intergenerational disadvantage. But also, on the other side, it's important for us to follow international trends and national trends and not be behind the curve on key issues. Key issues regarding perhaps climate change, or around technology and how that's applied, or around how customers or citizens want to receive their information. So there's a place for, I think, real reform in terms of dealing with the intergenerational issues, and those issues are unfortunately always ongoing and we can't ignore them. In fact, we have to try really hard to tackle them in different ways. But then you have those emerging issues which makes sure that New South Wales is always on the cutting edge. So recently, for example, we coordinated all the government's research and development capacity into one team, all the R&D stuff, and that was quite innovative, and established Investment New South Wales, which we haven't done before, and that's really to give our state the edge in terms of the jobs of the future. So it's really important for us to have an eye on those intergenerational challenges, which unfortunately have been there a long time, but also what is emerging and how can we be on top of that and be a leader, not a lagger, in those areas as well.
You mentioned the need for robust debate. How do you go about, when there are divergent views within government on a policy issue or intervention, how do you go about finding a way forward?
I'd be disappointed if there weren't divergent views all the time, because we all have different priorities on what we think is important or how something should be done. I think first and foremost, obviously listening to the expert advice. And then, as the cabinet process exists, normally there'll be a strong view one way or the other on how to deal with a matter, and cabinet often resolves those issues. But I think it comes down to the person who's got the leadership role. So if it's a minister having to make that decision, he or she will make that decision based on their advice. If it's someone in a public service role, well, the team leader, at the end of the day, I think what is really important throughout the public service and what's really important in government is accountability. Because I sometimes get frustrated when everybody, if you have 10 people in the room and they all express an opinion, that's all fine, but what's the recommendation? What's the call to action? Policy only becomes real if there's a call to action, because then it just becomes an opinion. So what is the call to action? What are you recommending? And if you can try and be quite clear on based on the advice and the research you've done, and based on what you think the government might think is an appropriate way forward, what is your recommendation? What is the way forward? How do we implement this? And I think that level of accountability is really important. Otherwise, it's really easy for all of us, including myself, to give an opinion, but it's much harder to make a decision and to actually own something and take it forward.
Very good advice, Priscilla.
Premier, you're well known for being an infrastructure Premier, and you've already mentioned about the nexus between policy and delivery and implementation. Would you like to just unpack that a bit more and the key role that policy does have in that space?
No, absolutely, and I think you know, infrastructure these days can mean a whole range of things. It's not just the bricks and mortar, but it's also the social infrastructure we're doing, you know, schools, hospitals, social housing, all that social infrastructure has to have a policy connection, because for what purpose are we building that structure, what's going on inside, and how is what's going on inside impact our infrastructure agenda? But also digital infrastructure, you know, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's access to information. So I think digital infrastructure is now having a different lens as well. So whilst infrastructure is critical, our day-to-day programs are just as critical, because we don't build something for the sake of it. We build something to make sure what's happening inside or within the precinct is valuable and taking our citizens forward and providing that equality of opportunity, which I'm passionate about, because I haven't done my job well if every citizen in the state doesn't feel they've got an equality of opportunity to be their best, whether it's through our school system, through our transport system, our health system, our social justice system. So that's really important to me. And I think the infrastructure is visible and it's obvious, but what is more critical, I think, is the social programs we have in place, and how are we implementing those, how are we delivering those, and how does it fit into our infrastructure pipeline and vice versa, one goes with the other. And I think the key to all of this is having good macro planning. You know, strategically, where do we want to take the state? What are the key issues we need to resolve to take the state forward? And how do we deliver that? And ordinarily the answer will be, well, you deliver it through better infrastructure, but also deliver it through better programs. And also I think government has an important role as an enabler. I know there'll be a lot of different views in relation to this, but I don't believe in heavy-handed government. I think government should enable communities, community organisations, non-government organisations to be their best as well. So we can achieve a lot through the government system and the government network. And obviously some things will always be run by us, whether it's our hospitals or our schools or a whole range of things. But we also have to remember that whilst we might employ 9% of the population in New South Wales who work, 90% aren't employed by us. So what impact do our policies have on them? What impact do our policies have on the broader community, which may not be directly involved in the government process? So they're the big questions and answers that we always look forward to.
So we've briefly touched on the role of policy staff within the New South Wales Government, and I know a lot of our members are really interested to know from you what you're wanting, relying on, valuing in policy staff.
I think what I value in policy staff is I'm someone that loves to base decisions on facts and evidence. So good research, and if you're not sure of a fact, don't include it in a briefing paper. Make sure you've done your research, make sure the information you have is up to date, because it doesn't matter how junior or senior you are in the public service, when you put pen to paper, it can impact a decision, and if the decision's based on a false premise, well then that's really bad. So first and foremost, make sure you've done the research well, the facts you have are the best information you have available. And also be simply stated. Sometimes we get caught up in our own language, and I always say to my team, and when I read a brief, if I don't understand it, how is the citizen out there going to understand it? And I don't mean it from an intellectual perspective, I just mean just be simply stated, just say very clearly what you want the person to understand. I'm a very simply stated person just by nature. So, and I feel that helps in communicating what we're trying to achieve with the broader public, because if you're not simply stated, if you try and be too complicated, or maybe you don't even try, it's just the nature, when we talk to each other, it's almost a different language. The terms we use, the public doesn't understand. So I just think it's really important for us to try and write in plain English, to be very conversational, very formal, like formal English, but simply stated is really important to get something across. And I often find from a policy perspective, it's much more difficult to get something down to 2 pages than it is to get it down to 20, because you can include a whole bunch of stuff that's not really relevant, but to actually synthesize, to actually be able to say, this is my recommendation in a short amount of time, or sorry, in a short amount of space, shows that not only do you understand the issue, but you understand what's important about the issue. So sometimes I really think from a policy perspective, less is more. So the initial research or information gathering process might be longer and more strenuous. But when you're providing advice, whether it's to your manager in the public service or to a minister or to someone external to government, I think brevity is really important because it shows you're on top of the issue. You've actually highlighted the key points and what's important for consideration. And if the person making the decision is worth their weight in what they're doing, they will actually look at the summary and then say, well, can I have further information on X, Y, Z so I can make my decision well? And so I think it's really important to think about those things when you're presenting something, and also accountability, depending on your where you sit in the policy family and where you sit within a department or an agency. I think it's really important to have someone accountable and own what you're putting up, so that I remember when I first became a minister now a decade ago. We changed a lot of our processes to make sure that I had clear vision of who was responsible, someone's name that I could call or speak to, or someone that I knew was a subject matter expert, which I could meet with, because often every minister and every leader, every public servant has a different way of operating. I actually like to read something first before I meet with someone, because I like to be in a position of having some knowledge. Otherwise you can't really have a good conversation or make decisions if you don't know where things are at. Other people have a different style. So for me, having that really good policy framework or purpose ahead of a meeting is critical.
Thank you.
So we've seen over COVID that governments across the country have been working closely together with the National Cabinet and those strategies. How can New South Wales take more of a leadership role at the intergovernmental level, and what sort of issues do you think we should be discussing at that level?
Yeah, well, I think COVID's demonstrated that states actually have a lot of ability to self-start or be proactive in a whole range of areas. So we have enough on our plate, and I think what New South Wales can always do is lead by example. I mean, our Service New South Wales app has nearly 4.5, I haven't asked the minister, he's got real-time information, but it was about 4.3 million people who'd signed up to the app last I looked, and that's out of a population of 6 million adults, which is amazing. So that's just one example where we can actually lead, and that's completely within our jurisdiction. We don't need to rely on anybody else to make that decision or to take that forward. So I think really being innovative and demonstrating how good policy can help our citizens, especially during a difficult period for our state, is leading by example, and then that example can be taken up by other states at national cabinet level. So I often think rolling up your sleeves and doing something makes you the natural leader in an area. And we have, I always say to our teams, we don't need to rely on, yes, the national cabinet process is extremely important in terms of the federation and the national approach, and as much as possible, states being on the same page with each other is absolutely critical for the well-being of our citizens. All of our citizens move around the country. We're one country, we're one nation. So any harmonisation or any being in sync, and often if someone's putting a proposal to me which I think might be a bit controversial, I'm not sure about, I'll say, well, what are the other state positions? So it's often the case. It's really important for us to always also know what the other states are doing and whether things have worked or not. I actually think it's really important to learn from great successes other states have had, but also some mistakes other states have had, and similarly for us, you learn as much from your mistakes as you do from your successes. So I think it's really important to appreciate the power we have, and I don't like to use that word in the traditional sense, but the role we have as a state to be able to take things forward without having to rely on that process, but also the ability we have to learn from that process and learn from other states on what works and what doesn't. But I also think it's really important to always have that point of comparison. If we are putting up something that hasn't happened before, well, what are the other states doing, and has it worked, and what difficulties or opportunities has that presented for their citizens?
So important to learn, I think, from a policy perspective on both what's happening within Australian jurisdictions, but also overseas jurisdictions. We can learn a lot as policy professionals from what's happening, and also drawing strength from our ability to implement things well. So we've got our last question, which is, what motivates you, Premier, to do policy well, and what achievements are you most proud of?
Okay, what motivates me to do policy well is the fact that we have an enormous responsibility to keep 8 million residents, citizens safe, having the opportunities in life to take them forward and improving the quality of life. So that's an enormous responsibility. So when policy outcomes actually achieve those things, you you feel extremely satisfied and rewarded. But I also think from a policy perspective, it's important for us not just to look inward. So I'm sure you do this, and I really enforce this amongst my colleagues as well, to make sure we have a very close connection to things outside the public service. So whether it's through community organisations or through business or through, to make sure that we have a good taste of what is happening outside of government. Because sometimes government is far ahead of what's happening outside government. Sometimes government is a bit behind what's happening outside of government. So I think from a policy perspective, we can't operate just within ourselves. We have to be really conscious of tapping into what's happening outside of government, what if it's an economic policy, or what the marketplace is doing, if it's a social policy, what are the leading NGOs doing, if it's the not-for-profit sector, what is happening in that space. So I think it's really important for us to be connected to the people we're serving, but also connected to the best in the business. Sometimes it's us and sometimes it's people external to us, and I think it's really important to bring that view to government, because when we make a decision, it's not just on what our traditional knowledge about something is, it's also about where the trend's going, where are things heading. And the worst thing is to implement a policy which then is outdated within 12 months. So in this evolving world of disruption, how can the regulatory environment satisfy the need for us to welcome new entrants, to welcome new competitors, to welcome people who are disrupting, but also protect those basic principles which we think are so important, whether it's protecting accessibility or protecting fare rises or whatever it is. Regulatory policy, government policy is about protecting as well as taking forward. So, and to do that, I think we need to always be really in touch with the outside community, the outside world. And I think good policy, well-rounded policy, takes all of that into consideration.
Certainly does.
So we're just interested, what, in your time as Premier and Minister before, what have been your greatest achievements in your
Well,
eyes?
I always say our greatest achievements are always what's ahead of us. But I would like to think one of my proudest achievements, I think, and it's not due to me, it's due to everybody else and my two predecessors and the secretaries we've had, is I think building our nation's best public service. I think the fact that people want to work for us, we've got the best and brightest minds working in New South Wales Government. And that gives me enormous comfort, because it means that anything we implement into the future has the chance of success, because we've got the best and brightest working with us and for us. And building that up, as you know, takes time, and having an amazing frontline presence, all the frontline workers that support the good policy we're putting in place. And I just think that sense of team is I hope, is felt throughout the public service and felt throughout agencies, because that's certainly one of the things I'm most proudest of. Because without a good team, you can't achieve anything.
Yeah. I'm sure that will resonate with everyone
Yes.
listening in today. Certainly if you're in a tough spot, the best thing to do is to rely on your team. Well, thank you, Premier, for sharing your time and insights with the community of practice. And we've really appreciated your candour and your insights and your time and your unique perspective, so thank you very much. I also wanted to thank our member audience, and thank you for joining us and for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. And I also wanted to thank Chris, Mark and Mark from the Premier's office, Lucy and Caroline from DPC, and Oscar and my team for helping us set this up. Our next webinar is with the Auditor General, Margaret Crawford.
That's interesting. I'll watch that maybe if I have time.
She may be watching in today as well. And that's on June 8. So I hope you can join us then. Until then, take care.